Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to once again be in conversation with my wonderful friend, Dr. Owen Emmerson. Hello, Owen.
Hello, it is always a joy to be with you, and especially when we're talking about the main lady herself.
We are so excited. Exactly. So, we are going to be talking about Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, their relationship, and considering a really interesting question, I think, and that is, was it love? Is this a love story? So, before we do that, Owen, we do have some exciting information or an event to share with our listeners and viewers. Would you like to tell them a little bit about it?
I would absolutely love to. Yes. So Natalie and I are teaming up once again to bring you a online event, which is beginning on the 6th of October, and it is entitled Rise of a Queen. Now, some of you might have joined us for our Downfall course and also our Making of a Queen, which charted Anne's early childhood through to her arrival at the English court. And now we're going to be taking Anne from 1526 right through to her coronation in 1533. I'm so excited about this because often we focus, or certainly I focus, on the early years because of where I work. And you obviously have penned the book on Anne's downfall. And we've covered those areas now. And now we're going into sort of the heart of the matter, which is the courtship, that great matter, and also the final decisive break with Rome in order to put a crown upon Anne's head. So we're going to be doing this over 6 lectures, plus a live Q&A, and participants will have access to those lectures for 2 months after the event ends. So I do so hope you will consider joining us because I'm really, really excited about this one, aren't you, Natalie?
I am so excited. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just look below and you will find the link. So maybe after the episode, you could have a little look at that, where we've given a little bit more detail into those sessions that Owen just spoke about. And of course, where you can reserve your place. And we do hope that you'll consider joining us for that. So now that we've got that little bit out of the way, Owen, we are going to be, of course, talking about Anne. And it might seem like a strange way to begin, but I just wanted to mention to our wonderful listeners and to people watching to perhaps just keep in mind that we're not talking about a character in a book. We are, in fact, talking about a woman who once upon a time walked this earth, was as solid as we are right now, and who had a family who loved her. Thomas and Elizabeth, her parents, certainly, adored Anne, and I think invested a great deal of love, time, energy into her upbringing, into her education, because of course they hoped that great things would come for Anne in the future. You know, she had a brother, a devoted brother called George, who I think really worshipped the ground that Anne walked on. And she, of course, had a sister, Mary. Things did get a little bit complicated in that relationship later on, but I know that you love the surviving letter by Mary Boleyn, Owen, and I absolutely love it too. And it's quite a long letter, but in there she says something that is very moving, I think. And she says that a life without Anne's favor would, and I quote, be a burden too heavy to bear. So I just thought by beginning in that way, we might be able to keep that at the sort of forefront of our minds, that we're talking about a human being who had people who loved her, friends and family, and not just a character in a book, because it's easy, isn't it, Owen, to kind of forget, because we've heard this story so many times, that these were in fact living, breathing human beings.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, Anne is one of the most widely portrayed people in popular culture. Many of us came to Anne through fictional depictions of her life, and they have varied, in terms of whether or not we were invited to be sympathetic with her, whether or not we were to judge her, and whether or not her experience was authentic.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets to the heart of what we are discussing today. How do we know what Anne Boleyn felt,
Mm.
because actually there is precious little of her, in her own words, surviving in the archives. So I think so very much has been assumed about Anne's motives, her agency, and I think we need to pause and ask ourselves how we know these things. And hopefully, this discussion will help.
Absolutely. And I think, maybe just a few words about the importance of telling Anne's story as accurately as possible. We've been of late, especially doing quite a bit of questioning of that traditional narrative that so many of us learned, as children. If you studied, of course, in the UK, some of us came to it through books or novels or however. But, we've been doing quite a bit of questioning. And I think it's probably important to maybe share a little bit about our own motivations. I know that for me, I feel very strongly that people from the past deserve justice as much as we do. And of course, language, the language that we use to describe women in the past and the stories that we tell about them, I think really matter. I think that's really important because not only is that justice for Anne, of course, but they shape the stories that we tell and the language that we use today when we're talking about women. So the language and the stories sometimes that we tell reinforce, I think, quite dangerous ideas. And we'll be talking more about that today. But that is my motivation. I feel that, justice is not just something that we want for people living today. I think it's really important to also think about people from the past, and telling the story as truthfully as possible is really important to me. How do you feel about that, Owen?
Very much so. I mean, my interest in history really crystallizes around a discipline called the history of emotions. And my studies at the University of Sussex centralized on 20th century history, where you get a dearth of source material. In the 20th century, we're sort of spoilt for choice when we're looking at people's opinions and really getting to the question of how people formulate desire and how they express emotion. Um, Actually, when we go back to the 16th century, the source base can be at best fragmentary. And therefore, I think it's incumbent on us to pay extra attention to the kinds of conclusions that we are making from such sparse material. I think it's very easy to, for example, look at Anne's inscription in the British Library book of ours, where she writes that beautiful couplet which ends with loving and kind,
Hmm.
and assume that this is a reflection of Anne's inner feelings towards Henry. I think we need to be cautious
Yeah.
because we must understand the audience that it's destined for, the time that it was written. We're not entirely sure when that inscription was written. Unfortunately, the signature is missing, which is usually a good indicator of when Anne was
Yeah.
writing. So I sort of bring, I think, to this area, or I try to at least, an air of caution because I am so used to working with thick and dense source bases. And I just overall think it really matters. It
Mhm.
really matters that we don't put words into people's mouths and thoughts into people's minds, because we have a responsibility,
Yeah.
not just to the people of the past, but to the people we are informing today. So it would be very easy, wouldn't it, if our job was just to rehash that which has come before. And those narratives are so dominant. But actually, I think it's much more interesting
Mhm.
to start questioning how we know things. And my goodness, when we do ask that very simple question, some
Mm.
real treasures get unearthed, don't they?
That is so true. I think the conversation becomes so much richer, which is
Yeah.
what I love. And I know that sometimes it's difficult to listen to, stories when you've been told something so different, or to listen to an opinion
Yeah.
that's very different from your own. But I think it's very important. And so I suppose a long-winded way of asking you, our listener and viewer, to keep an open mind. As we're discussing, and to keep in mind that we are talking about very complicated people. So, Owen, maybe a good place to start is just by recapping briefly the traditional narrative. What is the traditional narrative around Anne and Henry and the commencement of this relationship?
Well, there are, I would say, several sort of traditional narratives. The scheming Boleyn family comes immediately to mind.
Mhm.
That there was always a plan to raise Anne beyond her humble station. It wasn't so humble.
Yeah.
And evidence of this is put forward that first Mary was Henry's mistress, and then Anne is placed in the king's bed. That's a very traditional sort of narrative that is backed up in popular culture. So, for example, that's very much the narrative that Philippa Gregory went with the other Boleyn girl. And then there's the other narrative, which is sort of Anne being reluctant, um, and this stemming from the fact that the king thwarted her relationship with Henry Percy. But then there is a sort of a eureka moment. It's one of my least favorite moments in Anne of the Thousand Days, when Anne just suddenly falls in love with Henry VIII. My goodness. Um, and it's cast as a belated love story. I don't necessarily think that we can find either of these narratives in the historical record. Chiefly, and this is a point that we're going to keep coming back to, because we only have half of the story.
Mhm.
We're going to talk extensively about some love letters, but they're only from one person. And it's really incumbent upon us not to read Anne Boleyn into those letters.
Mhm.
Because even when Henry is referencing what he believes Anne is saying in her
Mhm.
replies, can we,
Yes.
is this just his expectation? Is
Yeah.
this his hopes coming through? This is a one-sided conversation, and therefore I think it is really important that we do not speak for Anne in her absence. What do you think of the traditional narratives, Nat?
Yeah, they're so appealing, aren't they? And for many
Yeah,
different reasons, and of course people have their favorite, and the Seductress has been an image we've seen for so long. It's so difficult to picture Anne, I think, without picturing Geneviève Bujold or Natalie
yeah,
Dormer, these incredibly beautiful women, and so it's hard to kind of look at the sources impartially without having those images in your mind. It's very, very difficult. I, like everyone else, I think, Owen, but really wanted to believe in the sort of more traditional tale of this having been an incredible love story.
yeah.
I really did. It's over 15 years that has slowly changed, shifted. Questions have arisen for me that it just doesn't quite fit that story, so I that's why I love exploring it, but I think maybe what we could do now is have a look at the sort of timeline and what evidence we do have, and then maybe go from there. So we have an event that's very often quoted when we're talking about Anne and Henry's relationship, and that is something that occurred in February 1526 at Greenwich Palace. So there was, pageants and celebrations on, and Henry rides out with a slogan that says, "Declare I dare not." Now, we know Henry loves this sort of theatre. This is very commonplace at the Tudor court. He's done it many times before. He loves dressing up. We know that. You know,
He
this is
does.
very much just typical Tudor court stuff, isn't it? So he's got that embroidered on his coat, I think. So declare I dare not. So people have suggested, stated outright that this was Henry's first sort of declaration of his love for Anne Boleyn. So this is February 1526. What do you think about that, Owen? Do you think we can firmly state that this is Henry telling us he's in love with Anne?
No, I don't. And I add caution. I didn't mean to sound glib there. I add caution because much has been made of an earlier motto that featured during the Chateau Vert pageant
Yeah.
that Henry wore a motto saying, "She hath wounded my heart." And this was given by many, many historians as evidence of the beginning or the end or something related to Mary
Mhm.
Boleyn. But if we look at the theme of that entire event, it's unrequited love.
It is.
So she hath wounded my heart would absolutely fit within the theme of the pageant itself, which is being given for the imperial ambassadors. So quite why that would relate specifically to Mary Boleyn when it fits the overall theme. I mean, we see that theme being carried through with the Chateau Vert pageant itself. So I think we're making a lot of hay here, and I don't necessarily think that there's a lot to um, grip,
Yeah.
shall we say. I mean, it could be, but it's a very unspecific sort of reference, and I would feel very, very uncomfortable stating with any degree of certainty that this could relate to
Mm.
Henry's feelings toward Anne Boleyn. What about you?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think, keeping in mind, so Anne's been back at court since early 1522. This is, presumably she's been serving Catherine of Aragon. Unfortunately, that's that period of time where we have no direct evidence for Anne, and it is so frustrating. Well, up until this point, anyway. I always have hope that something could be found, but we don't have direct evidence, so we're going by what later writers have said when they're reflecting on this relationship that Anne was in the service of Catherine. It does make sense considering the fact that Anne is extremely well educated. She's the perfect courtier. She's raised by a family of courtiers. So it's likely that she was in the service of Catherine of Aragon. But this is February 1526. There's no gossip about the relationship at this point. There's no one talking about anything special to do with Anne and Henry.
No.
So I think the jury's out on that one, Owen. So there is another piece of evidence that's used when talking about this relationship. And John Guy and Julia Fox, in their wonderful book about Anne Boleyn, delved into Thomas Boleyn's accounts, actually, which was really exciting. And they noted a couple of payments from the last couple of months of 1526. So one is a payment for £4, quite a significant sum, to Cornelius Hayes, who is, of course, Henry VIII's goldsmith, Flemish goldsmith. And there's also a second sort of itemized record there for an amount of £3, 12 shillings and sixpence for Mistress Anne's bill. So what they're suggesting there, Owen, is that this is in fact the bill for a jewel that we know Anne does give Henry because Henry mentions it in one of his love letters. So
Yeah.
the jewel that he mentions is a diamond with a ship, and it has a damsel in the ship, and she's being tossed about. And of course, the sort of symbolism there is that Anne is saying that she will agree to be with Henry, that he'll be her protector through the storms that are undoubtedly on their way. So, but I suppose the key thing there is that the account doesn't say that it's for that jewel. It just says that it's a
No.
payment to Cornelius Hayes, and that Thomas has paid one of Anne's bills. So what do you think about connecting that to the jewel that Henry mentions in his letter?
So I think this was a really exciting discovery, and of course it fits with the earlier
Mhm.
theory, or it seems to fit with the earlier theory that Dr. David Starkey proposed, which is that Anne's gift, her Estren, her New Year's gift to Henry, which he writes back thanking her for, and also thanking for the message that it gives, this message of hope, was Anne's way of saying yes, essentially. I think it's a really credible theory. It does place Anne at Hever that Christmas. We know that she's at Hever with Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn. So But my sort of difficulty with that idea that Anne was at Hever when she decided to marry Henry was the time it would have taken to commission a
Mhm.
jewel. So if she's at Hever at Christmas, she'd have to have a jewel commissioned in time for a New Year's gift. I don't think
Yeah.
it left enough time.
Hmm.
So therefore, I always questioned whether the decision was actually made at Hever or whether the decision was made before the jewel was commissioned and it was sent to Henry for a New Year's gift. This would suggest, I believe the bill is from October or
Yeah.
November.
Last 2 months.
Um,
Yeah, last 2 months of
Last 2 months. Yeah,
1526. Yeah.
exactly. So this would suggest that Anne actually, if it is for this duel, that Anne made the decision to say yes or to give Henry hope,
Hmm.
because it doesn't specifically say in Henry's letter, "Thank you for agreeing to marry me." He just talks about the significance of the duel as he understands it. It would mean that the decision was made earlier and that Anne was at Christmas when Henry received the gift. Hence why he sends the letter to Hever. That makes far more sense to me. But we don't have a wonderful inventory of everything that Cornelius Hayes made. It doesn't specify that it's for a bejeweled ship. I would say the price is about right for a royal a jewel destined for the king. That's we're probably looking in the right sort of ballpark figure there. So yeah, I think it could be. Is it like definitely? I would be hesitant to go that far, but very exciting find, and
Yeah.
it might actually marry up those two theories, um, something of a more concrete idea of when Anne got serious about the
Mm.
idea. But I just want a little bit more. She always leaves us wanting a little bit more, doesn't she?
She teases us, doesn't she? We say this so often. Yeah, I think it's incredibly exciting, but as you say, for me, it's not quite enough. And I
Yeah,
say that because if there was another contemporary account from 1526 that stated anything about Anne and Henry, that would be helpful, but we just don't have anything until 1527. So
yeah,
we're going to keep in mind that if this relationship started in 1526, it was kept absolutely secret. And I
no,
don't think at the Tudor court that is quite possible for very long, to be honest with
no,
you, Owen. So what we'll do, we'll move into 1527. This is when we know that something is going on. So in May
yeah.
1527, the ambassadors note that Anne and Henry danced together. That's really not a big deal. Of course, the king dances with lots of Catherine's ladies. That's very normal. That's all they say. They don't actually, they're just describing an event that happened at court, and they just mention that Thomas Boleyn's daughter dances with the king. So there's nothing, there's not much of substance there yet, but it is the first mention. That's May 1527. But what's really interesting, Owen, is that that's early May, by 17th of May, there's an ecclesiastical commission that's opened to talk about the king's um, doubts that he's having about his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So it's really interesting because it does make you wonder, did something occur, the day of the dance? Was there a conversation, or is this just the sort of beginning of something? Or has Henry decided that he wants out of that marriage before he's even decided that Anne's going to be his next queen? There are a lot of kind of what ifs. But what we know for certain is that on the 16th of August, so keep in mind they've danced early May, 16th of August, 1527, the one of the ambassadors sends a missive to Charles V and informs him, and I quote, that if the king can obtain a divorce, he will end by marrying a daughter of Master Boleyn. End quote. So this is now our first piece of concrete evidence that something serious is going on here between Henry and Anne. Henry very soon requests a dispensation to marry another woman. He doesn't say Anne Boleyn, just to marry
No,
another
yeah.
woman that same month, so in August, later in the month. And the wording of the request for the dispensation is very interesting, of course, because
It
he
is.
asks, and this is again a quote, to marry another, even if she has contracted marriage with another man, provided it be not consummated, and even if she be of the second degree of consanguinity or of the first degree of affinity. So it doesn't say Anne Boleyn, but it pretty much says Anne Boleyn, doesn't it? Because we know of, well, we know from later authors, of course, that there was some sort of relationship with Henry Percy. We know that there was at least a kind of fling, I'll call it, with Mary Boleyn, because we don't know the extent of that. It seems likely it wasn't anything too extensive, but we do know there was something going on. So this is necessary. And so this is late 1527, from mid to late 1527. And this is when we know, that it appears that they've already decided that marriage is the way this relationship is going, because why would he ask for the dispensation? You know what I do wonder though, Owen, and I'd love to hear what you think. It's because people often assume that this means that Anne has already agreed. She's shown herself to be willing to marry the king if he's gone ahead and asked for a dispensation. But knowing Henry, I have to wonder about that.
Oh yeah, no, definitely so. I absolutely don't think we need Anne's permission for Henry
No.
to apply for a dispensation as such as this. Um, this can only relate to Anne Boleyn if
Okay.
we think about it logically. The fact that it states that she could have been pre-contracted to another man but not consummated.
Hmm.
The fact that it cites that the man in question could have had sex essentially
Hmm.
with someone of the first affinity, i.e., Mary Boleyn. This is
This is Anne.
essentially a dispensation which is specifically about Anne Boleyn, isn't it? Can't
Yeah.
think of many other people that it would apply to. But it's very interesting to me that the Anne appears in the record so late. The what we've been through suggests that people, at least publicly, weren't aware of the attachment, or certainly were getting suspicious of it by May 1527. Have we got the chronology of this wrong?
Mm.
Were those letters sent in quick succession? That we've assumed that they span over several years. Maybe they weren't.
Yeah.
Maybe, I mean, there is no consensus, and we're going to go on and talk
Hmm.
about the love letters shortly. But I think this requires some serious attention because, as
It
you say,
does.
as you say, there the idea that the king could be courting one of his wife's ladies in waiting and then not be extensive talk about it is problematic
Mm.
because the court is a hotbed of gossip.
Yep.
And I suppose we could theorize that this was all happening on paper, out of court, in the quiet of Kent. But I don't really buy
Mm.
into that. I still think there would be questions.
I,
Um,
it's really interesting, I find, because of course, that traditional story of Anne as seductress, Anne as teasing Henry, forcing his hand, that story that Henry intended her just to be a mistress, essentially,
yeah,
and in the sense that we understand the word mistress, and that Anne's refusal, not genuine refusal, but refusal in order to push the king basically to propose to her, makes absolutely no sense, Owen. Because if we think about it, if we have May 1527 as them dancing, we don't even know if that
yeah,
was any more than just dancing, but let's just say May 1527, there's something going on, or something has just happened with them. And then he's already asking for the dispensation to marry her. I need to emphasize
yeah.
that, not to have her as his mistress, to marry her by August 1527. That's a very small, small window. So,
It
this
is.
idea of Anne keeping Henry at bay for years just collapses, as does
It
the
really does.
story of the seductress Anne when we go on to examine the language used in the letters. So it's so crucial, I think, to look at these things with a sort of fresh, open mind and just ask yourself, does this make any sense? Or have we all been, sort of going with this story because it's the one that's been told most often, if that sort of
Yeah,
makes any sense, Owen. So I think this would
it
be a
does.
good place to talk about these love letters. There are 17 love letters that survive. They're all held in the Vatican Library. And they're only Henry's letters, as you've pointed out. We don't have any of Anne's responses. They seem to have arrived together in a group. I think that's very important
Yeah.
to note. We don't know exactly who got them, how they ended up there, but what we think, what's the sort of likely, I guess, story is that they were stolen from Anne to be used as evidence when all this is, or the whole great matter thing is going on. And as you've mentioned, in order for this narrative to make sense, for that Anne, the seductress keeping Henry at bay, the letters have been they're all undated, by the way. There's no dates on these letters, unfortunately. So people have ordered them in different ways, and they've been thought to have spanned quite a big time period. Whereas I sort of think they were written in much closer succession to that. So I want to mention here, Owen, as well, the work of Professor Tracy Adams.
Yes.
Very exciting, and perhaps some of you have listened to the podcast episode that I recorded with Tracy, because she's come out with some really groundbreaking information that I think topples and turns on its head this idea of Anne the seductress. And I think we
Yeah.
need to go back to the sources, to the evidence, and ask ourselves, well, what is happening here then? Because I think we may have got there are some major issues with the traditional sort of narratives. So Anne's responses don't survive. They're not dated. There's no consensus among historians as to the order. They've traditionally been interpreted as evidence of that narrative that Henry asked Anne to become his mistress in our
Yeah.
modern sense of the word, and that she refused him. She toyed with him, and that this was strategic. This
Yeah.
was because Anne had her eye on the crown. She had her eye on Catherine's position. And this has, of course, attracted so much vitriol towards Anne. But I think what Tracy suggests is something very different. So, Owen, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about what Professor Adams suggests the word mistress actually means in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're often encouraged to sort of focus in on Henry's apparent offer to make Anne his official only mistress, as an offer of, this being the position that he has mapped out for her. You're not going to be my bride. You're going to be my one true mistress. And we've also been encouraged to believe this as sort of uh, a position that exists on the continent, in France, and therefore this is something. I believe the words he used are maison tête,
Mhm.
and that has been theorized to be, official mistress. But actually, Henry addresses Anne as mistress on six
Mhm.
occasions in the letters. Only the French ones, very
Yeah, which is
interestingly,
interesting,
only the
isn't it?
French
Yeah.
ones. Yeah, really. Because he does write in the language of love,
Mhm.
French, which they both share, but also in English. So I think it's worth actually looking at Professor Tracy's
Mm.
translation of that Soul
Yeah.
Mistress letter. So I'm going to attempt to read it to you now. As I debate with myself the content of your letters, I am in great agony, not knowing how to understand them, whether to my disadvantage, as in some places you indicate, or to my advantage, as in some places I understand them, begging you with all my heart to please make clear to me your sincere intention regarding the love between us two, for necessity forces me to seek your response, having been more than a year ago struck by the dart of love, and not being sure of failing or finding a place in your heart and certain affection. This last issue recently has kept me from calling you my mistress, because if you do not love me with another sort of love than common love, this name is not at all appropriate, because it denotes a singularity which is very distant from the common. But if it pleases you to assume the role of a true loyal mistress and friend, and give yourself body and heart to me, who wants to be and has been your very loyal servant, if you don't forbid me this by your rigour, not only will the name be your due, but I will take you for my only mistress, forsaking all others near you, from my thought and affection, and serve you alone, begging you to give me a sincere response to this my unrefined letter as to what and on what I can rely. And if it does not please you to give a written response, assign me a place where I can have it by word of mouth, and I will be there with all good will, no longer in fear of annoying you. Written by the hand of he who will willingly remain yours, H. Rex.
Wow. It's
So
quite a letter, isn't
it is. What a Lothario.
it?
We've heard Henry's words, and I think it's incumbent on us to really sort of hone in now on what Tracy revealed, and that was that the common meaning
Mm,
for the word mistress in the early 16th century was a woman that you love and intended on marrying, and not someone you want to
mm,
have an affair with. This is crucial, isn't it, to our
absolutely.
understanding of exactly what it is that Henry is offering her.
Mhm.
He's not offering her a place in his bed, or he is, but officially, as
Mhm.
he's offering and his hand in marriage. So there are many examples that Tracy gives of this being tied to marriage, this word, not
Yeah.
specifically about being a mistress as we understand it today, but
No.
actually about the woman a man intends to marry. And I would encourage you to go and look at those examples
Yes,
because they are
please.
manifold. But what I would like us to turn to now is what implications this has on the dating of the letter. Do you
Yes.
want to talk to us a little bit more about that, Nat?
Absolutely. Thank you. And I will put the link to Professor Tracy Adams' work below if you're watching this on YouTube, that is, because it's such an exciting paper, I think, and I highly recommend
Yeah,
everyone reads it. So yes, basically she showed that the word mistress, as we understand it, really doesn't become popular until the 17th century. So Henry, what he's talking about is marriage. Now, in order to make this make sense, Owen, in the past, people have said if Henry has been struck by the dart of love for a year already, and we know that he's asked for a dispensation to marry Anne in August 1527, then this letter must predate, that marriage, because if he's still here wondering whether she's going to accept his offer, then that's
yeah,
the only way that this has sort of made sense. And that has reinforced the whole dating of this relationship to 1526. But
yeah.
what Tracy suggests with this
But
new this new interpretation of the word and in considering it in its proper context and what it meant is that this letter now no longer has to predate the request for annulment, because actually what Henry here is saying, he wants confirmation that Anne still wants to marry him, not that she's going to become his
yeah,
mistress, not anything like that. So it is likely, I think, and certainly this is what's argued in the paper, that these letters all date from 1528, that they date from
yeah,
around the time where we know there's the sweating sickness. So we mentioned that there are 17 letters. Several of them talk about events that we know we can date to middle to late 1528, and possibly a couple in 1529 as well, when we're talking about the trial, the Blackfriars trial and whatnot.
yeah,
So it's a stretch to imagine that one of the letters is going to date from before 1527 all the way through to 1529, and that Anne's going to have these in one group for the thief to conveniently snatch from her. So I do think that what this is not Henry trying to get Anne to agree to be his mistress. It's Henry asking for confirmation from Anne that she still wants to marry him. And I think it's very
yeah,
likely that this dates from around the middle of 1528. Hence, the 1 year struck by the dart of love takes us smack bang to the whole first gossip about them dancing and then the king wanting to marry Thomas Boleyn's daughter. That timeline, I think, makes a lot more sense. But what it does, Owen, is that it makes it almost impossible to kind of view this as Anne the Seductress toying with Henry, trying to force his hand, because what it seems actually happened is that within a couple of weeks, Henry, for some reason, decided that Anne would be the next Tudor queen. And I mean quickly, like from about May, middle of May, in some sort of, that month. And I don't know why, and I wish we did. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. What could it have been about Anne if she's not this seductress? We need to take that image out of our head. What could it have been about her that caught his eye? Let's remember, he's known her for so long, or he's known of her.
Yeah.
She's been at court at least. If we, I think they probably saw each other on the continent when Henry was there,
Yeah.
when Anne was in the service of Margaret of Austria. But of course, she was very young then. But at least she's been at court since 1522. This is now May 1527 when we think the king's
Yeah.
suddenly decided Anne's the one. It can't be that love story. This is an extended period. He knows her, he's seen her. There must be something else that triggers the king's interest in Anne Boleyn. And Anne, and there are 17 letters, we're not going to read all of them. In lots of the letters, the king is trying, it seems, to reassure her. It seems quite
Yes.
clear that she's not convinced by whatever Henry is trying to sell her here. She's reluctant. And what I think is really interesting, Owen, is that a couple of times he mentions Thomas Boleyn, and he's not quite happy with Thomas Boleyn because he says that Thomas
No.
Boleyn's delaying things, that Thomas Boleyn said he's going
Yeah.
to bring you to court and he didn't bring you to court, that Thomas Boleyn said he'd be here and he's not. He sends George Boleyn to tell her all sorts of things. So I think the picture that it paints, once you remove that word mistress as being somebody that you want to have an extramarital affair with, is completely different. And I think it actually does show the Boleyns reluctant in this whole situation. Not of course they were ambitious, they're at court, but they're not after the crown. I don't think this is what the evidence tells us. Um, and maybe just to mention, Owen, that this view of Henry as a love-struck, king that's so desperate. We see it on the Tudors, that desperation that he has
Yeah.
for Anne, that lust that he has for her, is actually a sort of view that was promoted in the 16th century, but
Oh,
it
yeah.
served a very particular purpose. And that was to deride and to ridicule Henry and present him as an unfit ruler, a man who's governed by his emotions, his lust, his sexual
Yeah.
desires, like women were said to be. So this is an insult to the
Exactly.
king. And if you see the people that are spreading this sort of stuff, you'll understand why. We've got Reginald Pole, who, in fact, Anne's already been executed, really sadly, but he writes and he tells that story. So he says, "You, a man of your age and with such experience, are miserably burning with passion for the love of a girl," he calls her. And it goes on. And then we have Nicholas Sander, the good old Nicholas Sander, who later in Elizabeth's reign promotes that same story about Henry. So that that view was used, but there was an agenda, a specific agenda. So what do you think about that timing then, Owen? How does that change and shift the narrative for you?
I think it's entirely plausible, and it also accords with what Eustace Chapuis states that the Duke of Norfolk has said about his concerns about a potential marriage, and also Thomas Boleyn's concerns. There's very little here, isn't there, that suggests that the Boleyns are pushing Anne towards Henry, not least because, as you say, Henry's own annoyance at Thomas Boleyn on a couple of occasions in those letters. One, admittedly, is when Thomas is still really quite ill after the sweating sickness, and Henry is not being particularly gracious, and essentially is accusing him of stalling,
Yeah.
bringing Anne back to court. And he may well have been right. We just don't know. It does appear that Thomas was fairly badly affected by it, but again, we only know that because of Henry's letters, and Henry is sort of, I think, suspecting that they
Mm.
are
Yeah.
preventing Anne from seeing the king. But there is very little here that backs up the Anne the Seductress um, narrative, and it's always been very problematic to me that without Anne's voice, people have so confidently stated and still do that this was Anne's plan all
Mhm.
along to, keep him on a long lead and to wind him in as if she's fishing for something glittering and gold. My goodness, how can you come to that conclusion
Yeah.
without her voice, without her any sense of what she wanted from the matter? And it's not good enough to say, well, look what Henry believes that she wants. We don't have Anne's words on this,
No.
and we really don't, and it really is not good enough to impose our sort of suspicions, our judgments upon this situation because there is a void. And yes, we do need to try and explain in the best possible way that we can why, Anne chose this path. I do think that there is a moment of choice.
Mm.
Um,
Yes.
but also, I think it is incumbent on us to really deeply read those letters and notice also that there is some kind of emotional control going on.
Hmm.
On a number of occasions, and I think we're going to talk about this, not to tease, but a bit more in our course, that there are a number of occasions that I think there's a bit of emotional manipulation going on, that Henry is putting pressure
Hmm.
on Anne. So conversely, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that she is pursuing him with a goal. I think he is pursuing her. He is the hunter. She is an unknown entity at
Mm.
this point.
Yeah, and I think when you read the letters, and it's funny because I've read them lots of times, but lately when I've been reading them, Owen, I've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I have to
Oh
say,
yeah,
with his letters. And
yeah,
I know that, and this is not to put down anyone's research or opinions that believes these to be love letters, genuine love letters. Of course, I
no,
can't tell you what Henry felt. All I can say is what my sort of interpretation of them is. And I think that on the surface, yes, they appear to be incredibly passionate. He talks about serving her, that he is her servant, that he's devoted to her, that she's the only one he thinks about day and night, that he can't wait to see her. Does that sound familiar to you, Owen? To me, what started happening is and sorry to use a modern term, but I started feeling like I was being love bombed, like
yeah,
severely love bombed, reading them, the 16th century love bombing. And of course, I have to again talk about Professor Tracy Adams' work because she notes that this is not unique. This is how
no,
you court in the 16th century. Henry, and
yeah,
people always say, well, these are incredible. They're an incredible survival. And they are because there's 17 of them all together in one group. This doesn't mean Henry hasn't sent letters like this to other women. This
yeah,
just
yeah,
means
yeah,
that these survive. So I
yeah,
think we do need to be a little bit cautious when we say that this was a great passion that Henry fell head over heels in love with Anne, because I don't think that's the case, and I think we'll unpack this a little bit more as we move throughout the rest of our episode. But I think it's important to note that the language that Henry is using in these letters is incredibly romantic. There's no doubt about
yeah,
it. There are, sexual innuendos in them. He's talking about her breasts. He's talking about sending her meat. Like there's a lot of very flirty, sort of sexy talk in this. But we have to
yeah,
remember that Henry and Anne have grown up on a diet of French romances, of Arthurian legend. This is a shared language. And I don't just mean English
yeah,
and French, I mean the romantic language that Henry's using. If he's trying to convince Anne to not, you know, um, renege on her agreement to marry him, then he needs to convince her using language that she is accustomed to, that she's grown up with reading, that she would have, she would have, of course, come across this at the French court as well. So I think we can't jump to too many conclusions by the sort of passion that appears to be at surface level here. I think we all know Henry's a performer. He takes on roles, and here he's taken on the role of the ardent lover. There is no doubt about it. Um, but it's something in the persistence that makes me uncomfortable, and something in the fact that it's clear that Anne was reluctant. It
yeah,
seems
no, totally.
that I don't think we can deny that. I know that we don't have Anne's responses. I totally agree with you on that. But I think Henry himself is specifically stating, you've got to get those silly thoughts out of your head. And that's basically what he's
Yeah.
saying to her, and then the combination of being cranky with Thomas Boleyn for not being at court when he says he's going to be at court. We need to question whether this is something other than a genuine, passionate love for Anne, I think. What do you think about that?
I I totally agree, and I think that this reframing of the time frame also fits with what we know about his other relationships. We often say, why did it take so long to fall in love with Anne Boleyn? Well, we don't really ask that question of Catherine of Aragon, but he knew her for many years before he married her.
Mm,
And he knew Jane Seymour for many years before he married her. And yet, the first reference that we have of her being in his company is in January, and they're married shortly after Anne's execution. So that's a very short period of time again that Henry falls for Jane Seymour. Anne of Cleves, I mean, falls in love with her via a portrait and falls out of love with her very quickly after that. But Catherine Howard, is a very quick sort of obsessive
yeah.
falling in love with. And Catherine Parr, she's very well known to Henry.
Mm.
So I do think that there is absolutely room for this reframing of the courtship, if we want to call it that, of Henry and Anne Boleyn, because there are more than enough examples of Henry being fully aware of the presence and qualities of women at his court, but suddenly something changing and
Yes.
him honing in on them and having to have them. It's I can't explain it because it's
No.
not a feeling that I've experienced before. But yeah, it's not unique in Henry's world, in his very
No.
distinct world.
Yeah, no, no, certainly not. No, and there is a suggestion that if Henry has asked for this annulment, I just want to kind of emphasize this again by, August 1527, that then Anne must have been on board by August 1527. I think there's room to question that, to be
Yeah.
honest, knowing what we know about Henry and what we've just said. But I want us just to consider, Owen, if this isn't Henry falling head over heels in love with Anne, having that Tudors moment where he grabs her and they stare at each other and then it's love. Why then does it appear that within a couple of weeks, if we're going to stick with our May dates, May to August, but certainly May to the opening of the commission is only a couple of weeks. If this isn't falling in love because he's known her for so long already, why does he seemingly out of the blue decide that he wants to marry her and that she would bear the next Tudor heir? I know you've said you don't have an answer to that, but I just want to maybe explore that a little bit more and consider some things that perhaps haven't really been considered yet. And so I wanted to just briefly mention the context, the political stage at this point, the wider
Yes.
political situation, because I do think this matters. So, of course, we know that Catherine, by this point, has not fallen pregnant for many years. We know that Henry is obsessed with this idea of a male heir. I don't think anybody's going to doubt that. So let's remember that in February 1525, there's the Battle of Pavia. We have Francis, of course, being captured. We have Francis being released in March 1526. In May 1526, we have the League of Cognac that's formed, which unites France with the papacy, Milan, Florence, and Venice. Funnily enough, Henry was supposed to be part of that, but he was cranky because they wouldn't sign it in London, so he
That's
decided not
right.
to, like, typical Henry anyway. So by August 1526, he has made an agreement. He's gotten over his annoyance and he has agreed to be part of this sort of Anglo-French, group because there are growing suspicions of the emperor and his
Yeah.
power. Everyone's worried about this. Now, if we think about Anne for a moment, something does make Anne quite unique, and that is, of course, this incredible education that she's had. First with Margaret of Austria, then for around, we don't know again, but let's say around 7 years at Francis I's court. So I think, is it not more likely than rather than sort of Anne, this seductress, that we know now that hinges on that particular love letter and the view that Anne is refusing Henry to be Henry's mistress. But once you remove that and know that no, he was just confirming whether she wanted to marry him, we don't need to have that sort of seductress view in our mind anymore. So is it not more likely that it's her immense intelligence, her deep, deep piety, her exceptional education, her sharp mind, her familiarity with European politics, rather than
Absolutely.
anything to do with her physical appearance that has drawn Henry's attention, or something sparked in him to say that this is the right woman. And I don't for a second think that he's going to look at a woman who has a sullied reputation and consider her the next Tudor queen, the mother of his heir. I think it's very likely that Anne shares many qualities with Catherine of Aragon, and that's why he has actually turned his attention to her. And I do think it would have been her religious side as well that has captured his sort of imagination, his mind. He's seen something in her that makes her great queen material, not mistress material, as we know, queen material. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think it's very likely. I mean, I've been doing a very large project on Anne's image, and I think I can conclude that Anne is not the most beautiful woman at court.
Mm.
She's not necessarily someone that individuals lust over because of beauty, but because
Mm.
of quality,
Yeah.
because of style and substance. Substance is the key with Anne Boleyn, I think. She has a lot going for her. And I think this is really interesting when we go back and look at the political landscape, because why was Anne Boleyn in France at all? Yes, she'd gone to the Low Countries to further her education. That's the official line. But at the time, Thomas was ambassador there, and having your daughter in the
Hmm.
Archduchess's household is incredibly beneficial because you've got ears on the ground. The same can be said for France. Yes, she goes to accompany Mary Tudor as she marries Louis XII, but that marriage ends very, very quickly. And it appears that Mary Boleyn goes back to England shortly thereafter. We don't have much record of her in
Yeah.
France after that. So why does Anne stay? Well, Thomas is now stationed at the French court. He's between France and England because that's where the alliance now lays. So Anne is absolutely an inside ear for
Mm.
Thomas. And over those perhaps 7 years, she gets to know Queen Claude and her husband incredibly well. So having someone who intimately knows Francis and his ways, his behaviors,
Hmm.
um, is really quite beneficial, isn't it?
I think it is. And I think it totally is in keeping with his move towards a French alliance.
Yeah.
I really do. And I think, again, it's those incredible qualities that Anne has that have stood out to Henry. And I think we should and could also mention the fact that Henry is very fond of Thomas Boleyn. He's very
Yeah,
fond of Thomas. He will be
very.
for the rest of Thomas's life. Henry, I know it sounds strange considering what he's done, but Henry does seem to, in a very strange way, have a grand respect for Thomas Boleyn, and that he maintains that, really, doesn't he, right until the end. So there are lots of things I think that could have been at play here. Of course, we will never know, unfortunately, exactly what it was that made Henry think that's the next Tudor queen. But I know it wasn't a pouty woman with a sullied reputation. That makes
No,
zero sense. You don't, that's
no.
not the woman Henry's going to want to be the mother of his heir. So again, I think that one of the 17 love letters, just one of them, has done caused quite a bit of damage to Anne's reputation, to be honest with you, because it's not only made people question any other sort of story that you try to put forward, or interpretation, sorry, that you try to put forward, but there's also issues with Anne's appearance, of course, because we have the portrait medal, don't we, Owen, that is contemporary. It is almost certainly an image that Anne approved, that she thought looked queenly and regal and was happy to share that, yet people despise it. The moment you put
No.
it up, they say that cannot be Anne Boleyn. Why can't it be Anne Boleyn? Because that woman doesn't match their seductress story. But when you remove that story and you have a woman of deep piety, I don't feel that we have any reason to question that. A woman with intimate understanding of the Bible, a woman who is in every way a queenly material. This is what Henry has seen. So I think it's really interesting that once you start digging, you do have to question all these sort of things that we've been telling ourselves about Anne Boleyn, and the way that we've been portraying her. So, if it wasn't this great passion, this great love story, I do feel that it was much more transactional. That's what we're looking at, I think. Why do you think that perhaps Anne may have finally agreed to marry the king, if she had any choice in it? That is, Owen, really. Um, do you think this could have been a more transactional thing? Do you think Anne's great piety may have actually contributed to her believing that this is the correct path for her to take?
I think it's probably a combination of the two. I think there has to be there comes a point where you can't keep saying no to the king, without it starting to have real repercussions, for not only yourself and your reputation,
Yeah.
because let's not pretend that people aren't aware of what's going on now. They are,
Yeah.
but also for your family. You just mentioned that Thomas Boleyn is very close to the king. He has been for, since Henry's early years. There's a lot of pressure on Anne, isn't there?
Mm.
Actually,
Yeah.
if we step back and look at it, there is quite a bit of pressure on her, and she is incredibly pious. So I do think there must have been a point in which Anne said to herself, "Why is the king pursuing me?
Hmm.
Is this what I am destined to
Yeah.
do?" And one source that I really think we should hone in on as an example of this is what Anne says to the Venetian ambassador Carlo Capello. After her coronation, she says that God had inspired His Majesty to marry her. That, I think, is very telling.
Yeah.
And I think it might start to explain why,
Mm.
even when her family, as we know, are reluctant, they have no idea what this is going to look like. This is unprecedented. I
Yeah.
mean, let's not pretend that kings hadn't had their marriages annulled before. They had. Um, but the Pope has said no.
Mm.
And, the implications of what this could mean and does go on to mean are enormous. Also, we know that Anne is, she has reformist leanings. We certainly know that George does. We have no idea what Thomas's religious beliefs were. A lot of people have speculated, but we really don't have much evidence. So um, he might have been quite a lot more reserved about the
Yeah.
prospect of what a break with Rome would actually look like.
Mm.
He cannot have been anything but sure that it was absolutely going to scandalize Christendom, which it does. So I don't think we should ignore Anne's words here,
No.
that she was of the belief that God had drawn Henry towards Anne, and it was her destiny, therefore, to say yes. And maybe it was her faith, her understanding of the ideas of Tyndale, for example,
Mm.
which we know she goes on to place into Henry's
Yeah.
hand, that actually it's nothing to do with the Pope, that God is, uh, the king is next to God. And therefore, who is she to
Hmm.
question?
Yeah.
This does ring true to me. And I just have to say very briefly that I am absolutely team most happy medal, as are
Oh, what a
you.
coincidence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What a
What a
coincidence.
coincidence.
Love that.
I think this was about the substance of a woman, and I think
Yeah.
this bears testimony to the fact that this is not a story of lust, of
Mm.
looks,
Yeah.
but of piety and, yes,
Conviction
conviction, and I do think obsession on Henry's part.
on, yeah, on
I
Henry.
think I think the key to the obsession was not Anne saying no. I
Hmm.
think the key to the obsession was everyone else saying no.
Yeah.
I think we have misunderstood this story as one of cat and mouse,
Hmm.
but actually this is about king and court, and it's about king and country, and it's about king and Europe.
Hmm.
And it is at the moment that it's clear that the Pope is not going to say yes, that the many people of his court are not going to support him in his ventures, that this turns incredibly nasty. And
Hmm.
I think that is only born out of obsession. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because had the Pope said yes in August
Yeah.
1527, would we be having this discussion? Probably not, because
No.
would we be calling this a great love story if there hadn't been that period of struggle?
Yeah.
Probably not. So it's really interesting. And I'm so glad you brought up Carlo Capello and the quote that Anne says that God had inspired His Majesty to marry her, because I think that is the key here. God, religion,
Yeah.
religious conviction. I think if we're looking at this short, very brief window of them kind of talking and courting, if you want to call it that, but we don't know what Anne's response really was to that. I do think that there's so much we've missed, Owen, all those conversations between them. If Henry is being as persuasive as he is, or he's trying to convince her in his letters, just imagine having him in person, looking at you, this great big man, bejeweled and all powerful, God's representative in on earth as far as Anne's concerned, and he is telling her this is what God wants. This is God's plan for us. You need to save me, save England from the sort of hell that it's in at the moment. Can you just imagine? I know that's conjecture, but I think it's plausible that if the king is being like he is in the letters, that in person, and might that be why Anne is reluctant to see him face to face, because she
Yeah.
knows that there's going to be no way of getting out of it if she's in front of him. What do you do when you've got Henry VIII standing there telling you that God says you're the next Tudor queen? Yet Anne has gotten so much, vitriol directed at her because people say that she stole the king from Catherine. I can't even stress how far I think from the truth that interpretation is. I think Anne's reluctance, and it's not reluctance to be his mistress, reluctance to marry him, is about her loyalty to Catherine and is about her family's long service, loyal service to Henry and Catherine. And I do think this completely transforms this story. It is a whole different story, and it's a different Anne Boleyn. It's a principled Anne Boleyn. It's a deeply religious Anne Boleyn. So if we can just for a moment, Owen, think about if we take the love letters out of the equation, if we didn't have the love letters, let's just imagine for a moment, if we don't
Yeah.
have that collection of letters, what other evidence do we have for his great deep love of Anne Boleyn? Is there anything that sort of jumps to mind for you when you remove the letters from the equation?
I mean, going back to the British Library inscription in
Yeah.
the Book of Hours, we aren't sure if it was Henry's book or if it was
Mm.
Anne's book, but there are these two apparently speaking to each other inscriptions where
Yeah.
Henry talks about his pains of love under an image of the wounded Christ and
Yes, he
likens
does.
his pains to those wounds. So I definitely think we can see some quite graphic displays of love in that inscription. And if we're right, and that it is dedicated to Anne Boleyn, who appears to respond, um, she chooses an image of the Annunciation, which I think is a very tacit and sort of candid way of her recognizing what her function is,
Oh yeah.
or what one of her functions is, and that is to deliver an heir, a male heir specifically. Um, but very interestingly, I think her inscription, her beautiful couplet,
Very
is
telling.
slightly cooler than Henry's.
Slightly
She
good.
doesn't she doesn't talk of love. She talks of being loving.
Hmm.
And I think of mothers and fathers as being loving rather than love. But
There is a
that might
difference.
just
There's a
be me.
difference in tone. There's no doubt
There
about it.
is.
Mm.
By daily proof you shall me find to be to you both loving and kind.
Yeah.
It's beautifully written, but it doesn't pack the punch of Henry's, I've got open wounds for you. I
Yeah.
am suffering like Christ on the cross. Um, Maybe that's just because Anne's a little bit more sophisticated than Henry.
Possibly.
Um, but also, I do think we maybe should consider that the temperature of those sentiments might actually be reflective of the feelings behind them.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's definitely one of the sources that I would
That
suggest.
is one. I sort of one that jumps to my mind is, of course, all the gifts,
Yeah,
showering her with gifts throughout the sort of late 1520s, early 1530s. But of course, he showers other people with gifts, doesn't he? So
he
it's very
does.
tricky. Once you remove those letters, as you've said, the temperature immediately drops
It
in this
does.
relationship. And what we have is, yes, a king that is courting, Anne, but this is only after she's agreed to marry him. So we have to remember the sort of timing that Anne is reluctant and obviously having second thoughts, because that's what we see in these love letters, all the way
Yeah,
up until Cardinal Campeggio comes to England. So that is the impetus that has provided Henry with the sort of justification for that letter. He is just wanting confirmation. Are you sure you're going to marry me? Because I've got this
yeah,
guy here now that's
exactly.
going to, try and annul the marriage. So
It's crunch time.
it's crunch time. It's certainly not that story of her keeping him at bay, of,
No.
teasing him, all of that. There is just no evidence for it. And when we remove the love letters, what we have is something more transactional. He has chosen Anne because of her qualities. She's queenly material in Henry's eyes, certainly. And he needs an heir. Bottom line, he needs an heir. So this is the path he's followed. As we've said, I think at one point, maybe because of things Henry said to her, maybe because of her own prayer, her own spiritual beliefs, she's decided that this is the path, and she commits. There is a
Yeah,
point where Anne is invested in this story. I
yeah.
don't think it has anything really to do with a great love, to be honest with you. I'm not saying this doesn't turn into there is an affection. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that I don't think that's the source of this relationship. I think that's something that, yeah, probably developed. They have a lot of the same interests. They're both, really intelligent, charismatic, musical. So, of course, they probably had a good time together at various points. So, I do think Anne becomes invested in this. And that's what we see from about the late sort of 1528 onwards. We see an Anne that now is going to become queen. She's set
Yeah.
that in her mind too for various reasons that we've discussed. But without the letters, all we really have is the fact that this took a long time, but that has
Yeah.
nothing to do with Henry and Anne. That's because people wouldn't approve their plan. And the gifts. And the gifts, I don't think, tell us too much, because this is just what you do
It
in
is.
court.
It
You give
is.
beautiful gifts, don't you? You give gifts to everyone. You also use the word love a lot, because even in letters, I
Yeah.
was having a look, Anne tells Wolsey she loves him.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we can read too much into that either. And then there is the suggestion again by Professor Adams that whenever we hear of a happy Henry and Anne, it's when she's pregnant. And I'm obviously talking later in this relationship now, when we hear them being merry and all of this sort of thing. Anne is pregnant at those on those occasions.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there is literally a rhythm to these sunshine and storms,
Yes, there
and
is.
you know that the sunny days are around
Hmm.
conception, and um, and also around confirmation of pregnancy. I think we have a duty now to sort of reframe this, because one of the things I always get told is, how could he execute her if he loved, if he loved
Yeah.
her?
Mm.
Um,
It's a good
and
question.
it is a really good question, and I think it belies the fact that everything about Henry's relationship with Anne Boleyn was brutal. To get her, he needed to humiliate the woman that he'd been married to for 20 years. He banishes his queen. He
Mm.
stops her from seeing her only living child, her beloved daughter. That is brutal. It's wicked behavior.
Mm.
He kills two of the most learned men in the country
Mhm.
because they will not bend to his will regarding, not specifically, well, on one hand with Fisher it's definitely about Anne Boleyn, with More it's more about the
Yeah.
um, oath of supremacy. There is nothing pleasant about
There
what's going on
is.
here. Um, so when you actually start to look at the brutality of that period, the lengths that he goes to in order to make her queen, I don't think it is that unsurprising that he
Mm,
does what he does to Anne herself. The way he treated Catherine was appalling. The way
mm,
he treated Mary was appalling.
yeah.
And the way he goes on to treat Anne is appalling. You know, the way he treats Catherine, his wife, Mary, his daughter, and then Anne is appalling.
Mm,
And I don't think there's any sort of disparity between the way he treats any of these women in his life, women he loves.
well,
There's that word, loves. Um, this man,
allegedly.
did- this man did unspeakable things to people he believed he loved. Whether or not we should recognize it as love is another matter.
Mm.
And you know, it can be incredibly problematic to many people to suggest that a man who goes on to do what he did to these women um, could be capable even of love.
Yeah, and
Um,
I do want to talk a little bit more about that as well. But also just before that, I just want us to consider then, given the evidence, given what we know now with this new interpretation or this new revelation about the meaning of the word mistress, this new possible timing of this relationship, the fact that it isn't this drawn out thing, that in fact the decision was made probably within a couple of weeks in Henry's mind anyway. You know, we don't know exactly if Anne was on board right from the beginning or not, but at some point, you know, she becomes she dedicates herself to this for various reasons, and I don't think we need to judge her for that. I think this is just how this has played out, and I don't think she initially bore any ill will to Catherine or Mary. I think that's
oh
the
no,
other important thing. And we've gone to great lengths to look at the evidence about her alleged mistreatment of Mary, and it is very one sided, unfortunately, and there's not much there to go off. But if you sort of remove the story of Anne forcing Henry's hand, then it makes it easier to question those stories about Anne being horrible towards Mary and, you know, hating Catherine, doing this because she hates Catherine. I think all of that suddenly becomes quite problematic.
it really
And we need
does.
to look at Henry and really point the finger at Henry for all of that, as you've said. I really do think, Owen, that, you know, people that admire Anne, that that care for her, might sound strange, but we do feel a connection with her even from this distance, almost want to believe that this was a love story because then it somehow gives her life meaning in a way and makes her death almost easier to bear. If we
Yeah,
think that this is probably not a very happy marriage, then it's all the more kind of heartbreaking that this is what this brilliant woman that had a future as a mistress of a great household, you know, suddenly is reduced to just being a victim of Henry's cruelty, brutality, whatever you want to call it. It's very difficult. It's uncomfortable. It's confronting. I totally agree with all of that. But I think we do have to consider that the traditional view of the seductress, the teasing, this being a great passionate love story is just no longer tenable. I really do feel that. I just think that you don't kill someone you love, as you've mentioned that some people have said to you or have asked you about. And Anne's worth and value was not defined by her physical appearance. So we have to question all of those narratives, all of that story. You know, the view that Henry fell in love with Anne just because she's sexy, beautiful, or whatever is reductive. That doesn't capture Anne's essence. I actually think that Anne we think we know is really quite far from the Anne that lived. You know, I think we're looking at a
yeah,
much more religious, traditional woman. Yes, charismatic, elegant, stylish, incredibly talented, and brave as a lion. All of those things, you know, part of this family that was so connected and so close. Absolutely. But I think there are questions that we need to ask ourselves. You know, is this just a story we want to believe because it's a nice story, or is this based in evidence?
yeah. No,
Yeah.
totally. I think it's incumbent on us to really listen to those who spoke about Anne Boleyn, and almost unanimously, it's not about beauty.
It's not.
It's it's about things that people can't really put their finger on.
Mm.
They often say it's about her eyes.
Yes,
They
yeah.
can command attention. But actually, I think that's just sort of the portal into what's inside, if that makes sense,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
qualities. And people go to lengths to describe her qualities, which is intriguing because I think it is about substance. It's not about looks. But I just really, really want to sort of hone in very briefly about this idea of Anne the provocateur,
Yeah.
because I think it has real implications to how we view violence against women
Hmm.
today. Um, you know, there are many, many people who completely eschew the idea that violence can ever be associated with love. And as we've discussed on many occasions, sadly, in courtrooms today, this is still a
Yeah,
defense, isn't it?
it is.
You know, um,
Crime
we
of
do still
passion, I
see,
think it's
yeah,
called.
yeah, a crime of passion, as if that in some way negates
Mm.
the horrific act of brutality, or gives any kind of explanation as to why it was deemed appropriate. And yet we see it again and again.
Mm.
And if we can have those conversations today, and we do need to have them today,
Yeah.
we certainly need to be applying them to instances like this, because this is a very, very complex and messy uh, relationship that is made enormously more complex because we have fragmentary evidence of it. And chiefly, we are relying upon witnesses of this
Mm.
relationship, and we're not hearing about it. Certainly from Anne Boleyn, we're chiefly hearing about it from people who have agendas,
Mm.
some of it from the king himself, but very rarely are we getting the woman's perspective. Um, this is messy, it's complicated, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't meddle wisely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree with everything you've said. And I suppose just to also say that I'm not personally trying to convince anyone. I'm just offering a different perspective that maybe you'd like to
Yeah,
consider. My opinion certainly is that Henry orders Anne's execution because he wants her dead. That's sort of number
yes,
one
yeah,
thing. Unfortunately, for lots of different reasons that I go to, to great lengths to discuss in my book. And I think it was always about power for Henry, control, and that desperation for a male heir. I do think it's about that. But I agree with you. If this is painted as a passionate love story, then of course it romanticizes the crime, the execution, and detracts from the brutality somehow because it sort
yeah,
of lets him off the hook. I don't know. It becomes, if it's this crime of passion, then as you've said, it means that somehow the blame shifted onto Anne, that she's
yeah,
provoked him. She's left him with no choice but to kill her. And I think that is extremely problematic and dangerous. And as you've said, I don't think violence and love go together in any way.
no,
I just wanted to also mention, Owen, this and why I feel so passionately about this, and I think you do too. And you've talked about the fact that this has implications for us today, which is the key. And so I'm so glad that we're able to discuss it openly and talk about this. I don't know if you know the author, wonderful writer and activist Elif Shafak. So she recently highlighted something that I think I sent you. I think I messaged you about
yeah,
it because I was so moved by it. And that is that recently, and this is just one case of goodness knows how many, a lovely 17-year-old girl by the name of Saha Yousaf was shot dead in her home in Pakistan. And then when the media covered this story, Owen, they said that she was murdered by a man she had rejected, and I quote, again and again, end quote, almost justifying his killing of her because he somehow felt rejected by this woman. Look at the parallels with the story of Anne the Seductress, who
yeah,
again and again rejected Henry and forced his hand into marriage first and then to the scaffold, to have her
yeah,
executed. It's dangerous. It's dangerous sort of way of thinking of this. And so that's why I feel really that it's important to look at it again, to consider different perspectives, to ask whether, perhaps we've got some of this story wrong. And there's nothing wrong with changing your interpretations and, looking at the evidence. But I do want to end on a more hopeful note. And that is to say that I've been listening to so much of Brian Stevenson's work. Now he's a lawyer. He's a wonderful human being, and I highly recommend everyone go and listen to him if you haven't heard any of his sort of podcasts. And he works with, some people that are in very challenging situations in the USA. And he said something beautiful that I heard him say in a podcast, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is just perfect. He says that memory is the justice we owe. So when we remember people from the past, when we talk about their stories, when we, do what we're doing here and have this open discussion and talk about how we're feeling and how all this makes us feel, we are in fact, this is justice for Anne, what we're doing right now. This is justice just by us discussing it and opening our minds to and hearts to a different sort of story. And he also says that learning is a vital action item and that it actually prepares us for a more just future. So not only is what we're doing justice for Anne, it's in fact paving the way for a much more peaceful, I hope, and just society. So does that sort of strike a chord with you, Owen, as well?
It does, as historians, we are so invested in the past,
Mm,
and we spend so much time writing about people, um, and trying to do them justice. But there is a part of us that is always writing about ourselves as well.
mm.
We are drawn to certain people for certain reasons. So I do believe there is this symbiotic
Yeah,
relationship
yeah,
between the past and the present, that as historians, we have a responsibility to engender and to learn from.
yeah,
That isn't the only function of history, for goodness sake, but, if we can come out of this better people,
yeah. Yes, exactly.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah,
that's
because
not a bad thing,
it's
is it?
pretty brutal, isn't it? Looking at this story is confronting, it's brutal, it's awful,
Yeah,
so there must be, I am a hopeful person. I believe we need to end on a sort of hopeful note. And I think that's it, that we can draw lessons even from the brutal moments. We must
yeah,
draw lessons from the brutal moments to move forward
totally.
in a different sort of way. And, I do think that this does end some level of justice because her end was very unjust, as we all know. So, Owen, I can't thank you enough for always being so willing to come on and talk to me so openly about Anne's story. And I know we'll keep doing it because this is the work that we love and this is important work as well. So I do thank you for being so generous with your time and for coming back. The Talking Tudors community loves you. You're a star. So
Bless you.
thank you so much.
It's an absolute joy, and one of the most important parts of being a historian is being prepared to change your mind.
Yeah.
And I am constantly changing my mind because new evidence comes
Yeah.
up, or someone offers me a new interpretation, which I find compelling. So don't be afraid to say, I'm not sure now,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
I've changed my mind, because actually that's a really, really important part of being a historian or a lover of history.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I change my mind all the time,
Yeah,
and I
I
invite you
so
to
agree
too.
with you. And there's no shame in that, if you can put it that way. There's no shame in that. And so if you're watching this on YouTube, do leave us a comment, or even if you're listening on Spotify or wherever you're listening, you can drop us a line, leave us a comment, let us know if you enjoyed this. I've certainly enjoyed every moment of this conversation. It's been, really inspiring, I think, and eye-opening for me too. Even when you just verbalize things, it's really powerful. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for listening. And I'm sure that we'll be back talking tutors with you again very, very soon. So thank you and goodbye for now.
Bye bye.